Welcome to Life Stories, where the extraordinary moments of ordinary lives come to light. Today, we bring you a heartfelt tale of resilience, love, and redemption. It's the story of Lucas, a brave young boy determined to save his ailing mother, Hannah, by selling candy on the streets, when a chance encounter with Ethan, a successful businessman, changes their lives forever. We are reminded of the power of compassion and the beauty of second chances. Subscribe to Life Stories now to embark on this touching journey. Let's begin today's story and uncover the lessons it holds for us all. The summer heat pressed heavily against the streets of Chicago, where life bustled with unrelenting energy. The rhythmic hum of passing cars mixed with the distant wail of sirens and the occasional chatter of hurried pedestrians. On a corner near Michigan Avenue, Lucas stood clutching a small, tattered basket filled with neatly wrapped candy bars. His sneakers, worn thin and barely intact, did little to shield his feet from the heat radiating off the pavement. Despite the oppressive warmth and the ache in his legs, Lucas's dark eyes scanned the crowd with quiet determination, a persistence far beyond his 6 years. "Candy? He asked, his voice soft yet steady as he stepped toward a sharply dressed woman in a tailored suit. Her heels clicked briskly against the sidewalk as she glanced briefly at the boy, her polished appearance a stark contrast to his grimy hands and sweat-streaked face. Without a word, she tightened her grip on her purse and walked on, her floral perfume lingering faintly in the air. Lucas let out a small sigh, his shoulders straightening as he turned back to the throng of people bustling past. Rejection was nothing new to him. Around him, Chicago pulsed with its usual rhythm. Business people hurried by, checking their watches and making phone calls, while tourists gazed up at the towering skyline, cameras slung around their necks. Street vendors called out in loud, cheerful voices, hawking everything from hot dogs to souvenirs. Yet, no one paused for the small boy with the basket. No one noticed the way he clutched the handle so tightly that his knuckles turned white or how his brown eyes, though young, carried an ache born from too much understanding. "Please, sir. Just $1, Lucas said to an older man in a suit, holding up a wrapped peppermint candy. The man waved him off without breaking stride, his cell phone pressed to his ear. Lucas stood still for a moment, watching him disappear into the sea of people, before lowering his hand slowly to his side. The basket felt heavier than before. He adjusted it with a small sigh and sat down on the curb, careful to keep his legs tucked under him so as not to trip anyone rushing past. The day was long, and Lucas was hungry, but he knew the candy wasn't for him. Every dollar he earned was for his mother's medicine. His determination burned brighter than the sun overhead. Even as the hours dragged on and his body begged for rest, he had made a promise, whispered in a gentle voice as he kissed her forehead that morning, "I'll be back soon. Mama. Rest. Okay." Far from the bustling streets, in a dimly lit apartment on the outskirts of the city, Hannah lay on a worn mattress, her frail body racked with coughing fits that left her trembling and breathless. The room smelled of damp plaster and stale air, the silence broken only by the slow creak of a ceiling fan. Weakly, she pressed a hand to her chest, willing the pain to subside. Her thoughts, however, were elsewhere, fixated on Lucas. Hannah had begged him not to go out that day, her voice rasping with worry. But Lucas had insisted. He was always insistent, his small face set in a look of determination she couldn't argue with. "I'll be okay, Mama," he'd said, his voice as steady as his resolve. But as much as she admired his strength, guilt gnawed at her heart. She had promised him a childhood filled with love and joy, yet all she had given him was a life of sacrifice and struggle. Tears pricked her eyes as she thought of him wandering the streets, his two small shoes scraping against the pavement, his little hands offering candy to strangers who barely spared him a glance. "Stay strong for him," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. But her strength felt like a dwindling flame, and as the hours stretched on, She found herself staring at the door, waiting for it to open and reveal his tired but determined face. Back on the streets, Lucas's voice grew hoarse as he called out to passers-by. "Candy. Just $1, he shouted. His words tinged with a defiant hope. Around him, children his age played in a nearby park, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Lucas's steps faltered for a moment as he watched them toss a frisbee back and forth, their carefree faces untouched by worry. The basket in his hand suddenly felt like a wall, separating him from their world. But he swallowed hard and forced his gaze back to the sidewalk ahead. There was no time for games. His mother needed him. By the time Lucas returned home that evening, the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink. He opened the door quietly, stepping into the dimly lit apartment. Hannah stirred on the mattress, her pale face lighting up weakly when she saw him. "Did you sell much today, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas knelt beside her, setting the basket down and pulling a few crumpled bills and coins from his pocket. "Enough to get some medicine tomorrow," he said with a small, forced smile. He didn't tell her about the hours he had spent without a single sale, nor the blister forming on his heel. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he had made it through another day. Hannah reached out a trembling hand, stroking his cheek with a tenderness that made his chest tighten. "You're so strong, Lucas," she murmured, her voice thick with both pride and sorrow. "Stronger than I'll ever be." Lucas took her hand in his small fingers wrapping around hers as if to anchor her. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But in that moment, as the light faded from the room, he held on to the only thing he had, hope. Lucas slept lightly that night, his small frame curled up on a thin blanket near his mother's mattress. The rhythmic creak of the ceiling fan and Hannah's uneven breathing filled the quiet room. Every now and then, she coughed, a dry, rattling sound that made Lucas stir, his instincts ready to comfort her. At just 6 years old, he had learned to listen for the sounds of her discomfort, always prepared to bring her water or hold her hand. Hannah's illness was a shadow that loomed over their lives, growing darker with each passing day. Her once lively voice had turned frail, her laughter replaced by wheezing breaths. But even as her strength ebbed away, her love for Lucas burned brightly. She often lay awake, watching him sleep, marveling at his resilience. He deserved so much more than this life of sacrifice. It pained her that she couldn't give it to him. Morning brought a pale light filtering through the frayed curtains, illuminating the cracks in the plaster walls. Lucas stirred awake, blinking at the dull glow. His first thought, as always, was of his mother. "Mama, you need anything?" he asked softly, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. Hannah opened her eyes, offering him a faint smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she said, her voice a whisper. But Lucas wasn't fooled. Her pale skin and trembling hands told a different story. He rose to his feet, determined to make good on his promise from the night before. "I'm going out again," he announced, reaching for the basket of candy. His small hands carefully arranged the remaining bars, ensuring they looked appealing. Hannah tried to protest, though weakly. "You don't have to, Lucas. Rest today." He turned to her, his young face set with an expression far too serious for his years. "I'll be okay. Mama, you need your medicine." Before she could respond, he kissed her on the forehead and darted out the door, leaving her lying there, her heart heavy with guilt. She had no choice but to trust in his strength, though it hurt to see him take on burdens that no child should bear. The streets of Chicago buzzed with their usual energy as Lucas made his way back to his usual corner. The morning air was cooler than the day before, but it still carried the familiar scents of asphalt and exhaust. Lucas positioned himself near a busy intersection, where the steady stream of people provided endless opportunities. "Candy. Just $1, he called, his voice rising above the clamor of the city. Some people glanced at him briefly before hurrying on, their focus elsewhere. Others didn't even acknowledge him. But Lucas didn't give up. Each rejection only fueled his determination. Hours passed. And though his efforts yielded little, Lucas didn't let it dampen his spirit. He knew why he was doing this. Every dollar in his pocket brought him closer to the medicine his mother desperately needed. By midday, his small legs ached, and hunger gnawed at his stomach. He stopped briefly to sit on the curb, taking a moment to catch his breath. As he rested, he watched other children pass by, holding their parents' hands or laughing with friends. For a fleeting moment, he imagined what it might feel like to be one of them, to have no worries beyond which game to play next. But the thought quickly faded, replaced by the image of his mother's tired smile. "Candy, sir?" Lucas asked as a man in a suit passed by, his voice polite but laced with urgency. The man hesitated, glancing at the basket before shaking his head and walking on. Lucas sighed and stood, brushing off the disappointment. He had no time to dwell on it. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the city in hues of gold and amber, Lucas's voice grew hoarse. His legs felt heavy, but he pressed on. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed someone watching him. A man stood near the edge of the sidewalk, dressed in a crisp shirt and tie. His gaze was fixed on Lucas, a mixture of curiosity and concern in his expression. "Hey, kid," the man called out. Stepping closer, Lucas turned to face him, clutching the basket tightly. "You selling candy?" Lucas nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. Just $1, he said, holding up a chocolate bar. His voice, though tired, carried a spark of hope. The man studied him for a moment, his sharp eyes taking in the boy's worn shoes and the frayed basket. Finally, he pulled out his wallet. "I'll buy all of it," he said. Lucas's eyes widened in disbelief. "All of it," he repeated, his voice almost trembling. The man nodded, handing over a crisp bill. Lucas scrambled to pack the candy into a bag, his hands fumbling in his excitement. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much," he exclaimed. The man smiled faintly but then hesitated. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lucas," the boy replied. "And why are you out here?" "Lucas, shouldn't you be home?" The question was gentle, but Lucas felt its weight. "I'm selling candy for my mom," he said softly. "She's sick, and I need to buy her medicine." The man's expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable passing over his face. "Where's your mom now?" Lucas hesitated, unsure of how much to share. "She's at home, but she's not doing so good." The man glanced at his watch, then back at Lucas. "Take me to her," he said, his tone kind but firm. Lucas blinked, surprised by the request. "What?" "I want to meet her," the man said simply. "Let's go." After a long pause, Lucas nodded. "Okay." And with that, Lucas began leading the man back toward the small apartment he called home, unaware of how this encounter would change everything. Lucas walked ahead, his small frame weaving through the evening crowd with practiced ease, the tattered basket bouncing lightly against his side. The man followed closely, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement, a stark contrast to Lucas's frayed sneakers. As they made their way through the streets, Lucas stole glances over his shoulder, unsure of what to make of his unexpected companion. The man had introduced himself as Ethan Reynolds. Though his name didn't mean much to Lucas, all he knew was that Ethan had bought all his candy and seemed genuinely interested in helping his mother. It was a kindness Lucas rarely encountered, and he wasn't sure whether to trust it. "Is it far?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. "Not really," Lucas replied, his voice hesitant. "It's just a couple more blocks." Ethan nodded, his gaze lingering on the boy. There was something about Lucas, his resilience, his determination, that tugged at something deep within Ethan. The boy reminded him of himself at that age, though he couldn't quite place why. When they reached the apartment building, Lucas led Ethan up a narrow staircase. The air grew heavier with each step. The smell of damp plaster and stale air seeping into the dimly lit hallway. Lucas stopped in front of a door with peeling paint and turned to Ethan. His expression a mix of pride and apprehension. "This is us," he said softly before pushing the door open. Inside. The apartment was as modest as Ethan had imagined. A single room served as both a living space and a bedroom, with a small kitchen tucked into one corner. The furnishings were sparse: a worn couch, a lopsided table, and a mattress pushed against the wall. On the mattress lay Hannah, her pale face barely visible against the thin, discolored pillow. "Mama, I'm home," Lucas called gently, setting the basket down and rushing to her side. Hannah stirred, her eyes fluttering open. The sight of Lucas brought a faint smile to her lips, though the effort seemed to drain her. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice raspy. Lucas knelt beside her, holding her hand. "I sold all the candy, Mama." "This man bought it all," he said, glancing back at Ethan, who lingered near the door. Hannah's gaze shifted to Ethan, her brow furrowing slightly. For a moment, she simply stared at him, her breath catching. Ethan stepped forward, his movements measured, as though he were afraid to disturb the fragile calm of the room. "Hi," he said softly, offering a small smile. "I'm Ethan. Lucas told me about you." Hannah's lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but no words came. Her eyes widened, recognition flashing across her face. It was a look Ethan couldn't quite decipher: fear, disbelief, and something else entirely. He hesitated, unsure of what to say. Lucas, oblivious to the tension, beamed up at Ethan. "Mr. Ethan's really nice. Mama, he said he wants to help us." Hannah's hand trembled as she gripped the edge of the blanket. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice barely audible. "But we'll be fine." Ethan's brows knit together. "With all due respect. It doesn't look like you're fine. Lucas is out there working harder than most adults. And he stopped himself, his tone softening. "You need help. Let me help." Hannah's gaze dropped, her chest rising and falling unevenly. She wanted to refuse, to protect the fragile sense of independence she had clung to for so long. But as she looked at Lucas, who sat beside her with hopeful eyes, she realized she didn't have the luxury of pride. "I don't even know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You don't have to," Ethan replied firmly. "Let's focus on getting you the care you need." Lucas looked between them, his small face lighting up with a grin. "Does that mean Mama's gonna get better?" Ethan crouched beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'll do everything I can," he said, his voice steady. "We'll start by getting her back to the hospital." Hannah stiffened, shaking her head weakly. "No, I can't afford. I'll take care of it." Ethan interrupted gently but firmly. "Please, let me do this." Hannah stared at him, her heart pounding. There was something in his eyes, genuine concern, perhaps even guilt, that convinced her he meant every word. Slowly, she nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Lucas hugged her tightly, his small arms wrapped around her frail frame. "See, Mama, I told you it was gonna be okay." Ethan stood, pulling out his phone to arrange for transportation. As he made the call, his thoughts raced. There was something about Hannah, something familiar that he couldn't shake. And as he watched her struggle to sit up, he couldn't help but wonder if their paths had crossed before. For now, though, he pushed the thought aside. The priority was getting her the help she needed and finding a way to give Lucas the childhood he deserved. The ride to the hospital was quiet, broken only by the occasional cough from Hannah and the muffled hum of traffic outside. Lucas sat beside her, clutching her hand as if his small grip could anchor her to him. Ethan sat on her other side, his mind churning with thoughts he couldn't quite articulate. There was something about this moment, this family, that felt both unfamiliar and deeply personal. When they arrived, The hospital was awash in the harsh light of fluorescent bulbs. Its cold, sterile air a stark contrast to the humid streets outside. Ethan handled the admission process, his authoritative tone cutting through the indifference of the staff. Lucas hovered close to Hannah as she was transferred to a wheelchair, his wide eyes darting between her pale face and the bustling nurses. "Is Mama going to be okay?" Lucas asked, his voice trembling as he looked up at Ethan. Ethan knelt to meet his gaze. "We're doing everything we can, Lucas," he said gently. "She's in the right place now." Hannah was wheeled away for tests, leaving Lucas and Ethan in the waiting room. Lucas fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, his usual energy dulled by worry. Ethan sat beside him, watching the boy with a mixture of admiration and sadness. "You're a brave kid, Lucas," Ethan said after a long silence. Lucas shrugged, his small shoulders lifting in an almost resigned way. "I have to be. Mama needs me." Ethan's chest tightened at the boy's words. He had always prided himself on his resilience, his ability to weather life's challenges. But Lucas's quiet determination humbled him. Here was a child who carried a weight far too heavy for his years. Yet he bore it with a strength Ethan couldn't ignore. The hours dragged on, the monotony of the waiting room interrupted only by the occasional call of a nurse or the shuffle of patients. Ethan watched Lucas grow increasingly restless, his small hands twisting together as he glanced anxiously toward the hallway where his mother had disappeared. "Lucas," Ethan said softly, leaning closer, "tell me about your mom." Lucas brightened slightly at the question, his young face lighting up with a flicker of pride. "She's the best," he said. "Even when she's tired or sick, she always tries to smile for me. She says I'm her little superhero." Ethan smiled faintly. "She sounds like an amazing woman." "She is," Lucas said firmly. But his smile faltered, and he looked down at his hands. "I just wish I could help her more. Sometimes I feel like no matter how hard I try, it's not enough." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on Lucas's shoulder. "You're doing more than most kids your age ever would. Your mom sees that, and it means everything to her." Before Lucas could respond, a nurse approached them. "Mr. Reynolds," she asked, glancing at Ethan. "We need to speak with you about Ms. Carter's condition." Ethan stood, his heart pounding as he followed the nurse down the hall. She led him to a small, windowless room where a doctor was waiting. The conversation that followed was clinical and grim. Hannah's condition was serious, she would need extensive treatment, and her recovery would be slow and uncertain. The cost, of course, would be significant. Ethan returned to the waiting room, his mind heavy with the weight of the news. Lucas looked up at him expectantly, his wide eyes filled with a trust that made Ethan's chest ache. "She's resting now," Ethan said, forcing a smile. "The doctors are going to do their best to help her." Lucas nodded, his expression a mix of relief and worry. "Can we see her soon?" Ethan promised. As they waited, Ethan's thoughts turned to the woman lying in the hospital bed. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen her before, that her face was tied to a memory buried deep in his past. The more he tried to place it, the more elusive it became, like a word on the tip of his tongue. But one thing was clear, he couldn't walk away from this, not from Hannah, not from Lucas. They needed him. And for reasons he couldn't yet explain, he needed them too. Ethan paced the length of the waiting room, the soft click of his polished shoes against the tile floor the only sound breaking the silence. Lucas sat nearby, his small legs swinging off the edge of the chair, his attention divided between watching Ethan and fiddling with a candy wrapper he had retrieved from his basket. Hannah's pale, trembling form stayed fresh in Ethan's mind. There was something deeply unsettling about seeing her so fragile, her energy so faint it seemed like it could flicker out at any moment. Yet, despite her weakness, there was a resilience in her eyes, a quiet strength that mirrored the determination Ethan had seen in Lucas. It was haunting. "Mr. Ethan," Lucas called softly, breaking Ethan's reverie. Do you think Mama remembers what it's like to not be sick? The question caught Ethan off guard. He stopped pacing and turned to face the boy. I think she does, he said after a pause, crouching down to Lucas's eye level. But more than that, I think she remembers what it's like to be strong. And I think she's still strong now, even if it doesn't look that way. Lucas nodded thoughtfully, his expression serious. She is strong, he said firmly. But I wish I could make her feel better faster. You're doing more than you realize, Lucas. Ethan replied, his voice gentle. Just being here, being you, is helping her more than you know. Before Lucas could respond, a nurse appeared in the doorway, her clipboard pressed against her chest. Miss Carter is awake now, she said with a small smile. You can go see her. Lucas was on his feet in an instant, his earlier fatigue forgotten. He darted down the hallway with Ethan following close behind, the boy's excitement tempered by Ethan's quiet apprehension. Hannah's room was small and dimly lit, the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor providing a soft backdrop. She looked even frailer under the harsh hospital lights. But her eyes lit up the moment Lucas entered the room. Mama! Lucas exclaimed, rushing to her bedside. He grasped her hand, his small fingers curling tightly around hers. Hannah smiled weakly, her free hand reaching out to smooth his unruly hair. Hey, sweetheart, she murmured, her voice hoarse but warm. You doing okay? I'm fine, Lucas said quickly. Mr. Ethan's been helping me. He bought all my candy. And he brought you here. At the mention of Ethan, Hannah's gaze shifted. Her eyes landed on him. And for a moment, the room seemed to still. Her expression was unreadable, part surprise, part apprehension. Then her lips parted, and she spoke softly, almost hesitantly. You, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan stepped closer, his brow furrowing. Do we know each other? He asked, though the question felt strange as it left his mouth. Deep down, he felt as though he already knew the answer. Hannah swallowed hard, her eyes darting to Lucas and then back to Ethan. 6 years ago, she said, her voice trembling. Chicago. A hotel downtown. You. Ethan's heart began to race as the memories flooded back. A rainy night. The soft glow of city lights through a hotel room window. And the warmth of a fleeting connection with a woman whose name he had never asked. His mind scrambled to process the implications. But as his gaze shifted to Lucas, the pieces began to fall into place. Lucas, Ethan said slowly, his voice thick with emotion. His. Hannah nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. His your son. The words hung in the air, sharp and unrelenting. Ethan felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. His gaze moved back to Lucas, who was still holding his mother's hand. His wide eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and concern. My son. Ethan repeated, the weight of the revelation settling heavily on his chest. He looked at Hannah, his voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you tell me? I couldn't, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't know how to find you. And by the time I realized I was pregnant, you were already gone. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of disbelief, guilt, and something else, something unexpected. He looked at Lucas again, this time seeing him in a new light. The resemblance was undeniable, the determined set of his jaw, the spark of resilience in his eyes. Lucas shifted uncomfortably under Ethan's gaze. Mr. Ethan, he asked hesitantly, what's wrong? Ethan crouched down beside him, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. Nothing's wrong, Lucas, he said softly. In fact, I just found out something amazing. What? Lucas asked, tilting his head. Ethan smiled faintly, his voice filled with emotion. That I'm not just here to help your mom. I'm here for you too. Lucas blinked, his young mind working to process the words. You mean, you're staying? Ethan nodded, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. I'm not going anywhere. Lucas. I promise. For the first time, Ethan felt a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. Whatever came next, he would face it, not alone, but as part of a family he hadn't known he had. The air in the hospital room hung heavy, the quiet hum of monitors filling the silence as Ethan sat beside Hannah's bed. Lucas had drifted off in a chair nearby, his small body curled up under a blanket Ethan had asked a nurse to bring. The dim light cast soft shadows across his peaceful face, and Ethan found himself staring at the boy, his heart a mix of awe and guilt. How do you even begin to make up for 6 years? Ethan murmured, breaking the silence. Hannah turned her head slightly, her frail body propped up by a stack of pillows. Her expression was weary but kind, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't, she said simply. You start from here. Her words struck him deeply, for all the confusion and frustration Ethan felt about the past. Hannah's tone carried no resentment. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance that both humbled and unsettled him. She had carried this burden alone for years. And yet here she was, willing to give him a chance to be part of their lives. Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. I didn't even know your last name back then, he admitted. I didn't try to find you because, well, I didn't think there was anything to find. It was just one night. Hannah's gaze softened, and she nodded. It was, she said, her voice calm. But it gave me Lucas. And for that, I wouldn't change a thing. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. How had she managed to find peace in all of this while he had spent the past 6 years consumed by his own hollow pursuits? The contrast between their lives was stark. Ethan, with his pristine suits and luxury penthouses, and Hannah, barely scraping by, yet raising a boy with more courage and heart than most adults he knew. I want to do right by him, Ethan said finally, his voice firm. By both of you. I don't know what that looks like yet. But I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere. Hannah's lips curved into a faint smile, though the lines of worry on her face didn't ease entirely. Lucas needs stability, she said. He's already been through so much. And me. I can't keep doing this alone. You won't have to. Ethan replied. I'll figure it out. Whatever you need. Whatever he needs, I'll make it happen. The certainty in his tone gave her a small sense of relief. But she still felt the weight of caution pressing against her chest. It wasn't just about money or promises. Trust was fragile. And she wasn't ready to hand it over completely. As the night wore on, Ethan's thoughts began to shift. For so long, his life had revolved around the next deal, the next goal, the next rung on the ladder. But now, sitting in this small hospital room with a woman who had sacrificed everything for her son and a boy who looked at the world with unwavering hope, Ethan realized he had been chasing the wrong things. When morning came, the hospital was bathed in soft sunlight, and Lucas stirred awake. He blinked sleepily, his eyes darting around the room before landing on Ethan. You're still here, he said, his voice tinged with surprise. Ethan smiled. Told you I'm not going anywhere. Lucas grinned, climbing down from his chair to stand beside Ethan. Does that mean you're going to help Mama get better? Yes, Ethan said firmly. And not just better, I'm going to make sure you both have everything you need. Lucas's grin widened, and he turned to Hannah, his voice bright. See, Mama, I told you everything would be okay. Hannah reached out to touch Lucas's cheek, her eyes glistening with tears. You're my little miracle, she whispered. You always have been. Ethan stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond himself. It wasn't just about helping Hannah or being there for Lucas. It was about building something real, something that mattered. He turned back to them, a quiet determination in his gaze. This is just the beginning, he said softly. We'll figure it out together. Hannah nodded, her heart swelling with cautious hope. She didn't know what the future held. But in that moment, she allowed herself to believe that better days were possible. Lucas, oblivious to the weight of the moment. Beamed up at Ethan with pure, unguarded trust. And for Ethan, that was all the motivation he needed. In the weeks that followed, Ethan became a constant presence in Lucas and Hannah's lives. He arranged for Hannah to receive the best medical care, ensuring her health improved day by day. Lucas thrived with the newfound stability, his laughter filling the once quiet apartment as he and Ethan formed an unbreakable bond. For Ethan, life transformed from a relentless pursuit of success to a journey rooted in love and connection. Hannah watched with gratitude as her son flourished and found the father figure he had always deserved. Though the road ahead wasn't without challenges, they faced it together as a family. Sometimes, life gives us unexpected second chances to love, to heal, and to rediscover what truly matters. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Life Stories for more meaningful tales. Let us continue sharing stories that inspire and connect us all.